So when Zimbabwe was, it first caught our attention in 1999 when something called Operation Sovereign Legitimacy took place. And this was in 1999 when then a young up and coming Susan Rice, who was the Assistant Secretary for African Affairs under the Clinton administration, working under the leadership of Madeleine Albright, were planning a reinvasion of the Congo after the death of Mobutu Sese Seko. And at the time, Zimbabwe was the chair of the defense arm of all of Southern Africa. Every year, the Southern African Development Community, which is the umbrella of all the Southern African organization, so it was Zimbabwe's turn to handle that responsibility. So Zimbabwe's military, Angola's military, and Namibia's military had decided that they would go in and protect the Congo. And Susan Rice, her pet project, they were planning a reinvasion of the Congo. And Uganda was involved and Burundi was involved. And there was a spirited clash between Madiba Nelson Mandela and His Excellency Robert Mugabe. But the decision was made that the Congo, which was now part of the Southern African Development Community, would be defended.
The Allies decided to go into the Congo to support the legitimate government of President Kabila, and especially to uphold the principle of national sovereignty, the sovereignty of the Congo. We were seen, we the Allies, as the violators of the principle of national sovereignty, and not those who had invaded. To this day, the great powers, America, Britain, and others, have not condemned Uganda and Rwanda for invading the Congo. And this is a very serious matter to us, because we uphold the Charter of the United Nations and the principle of national sovereignty and non-interference in the domestic affairs of a country.
So similar to the way that Cuba fought off the Bay of Pigs in 3 days, Zimbabwe, Namibia, and Angola dealt with it quickly. And so that's when the United States started to really look at Zimbabwe differently. But going back before that, 20 years before that, before their independence, there were some negotiations that began in London called the Lancaster House negotiations. And Robert Mugabe leading the Zimbabwe African National Union, and the late former vice president and national hero, Joshua Nkomo, who was considered father of Zimbabwe, the oldest freedom fighter of that particular group. They were negotiating with Jimmy Carter and Margaret Thatcher of Britain. And the agreement was between 1980 and 1990, $5 billion would be put up to help the British and Rhodesians either relocate back to Britain, or they would move off 70% of the most fertile land in the country that they occupied as a result of the colonizing and the conquering by the British South African Company under the leadership of Cecil John Rhodes in 1890. So the agreement was made. On the United States side, Reagan comes into play and says he's not going to honor the agreement. And Thatcher made some overtures. Her replacement, John Major, made some overtures. But then the cheap carbon copy of Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, comes into the mix and says that he's going to pursue regime change. So the first step was to Zimbabwe dealing with being a fighting force, stopping imperialist exploits in the Congo. So that put them under the radar. But then they embarked on a land reclamation program where 4,500 commercial farmers of European, British, Rhodesian ancestry in particular, the land was reclaimed from them, and the land was given to 350,000 indigenous Zimbabwean families. The average family in Zimbabwe consists of 8 people. 1 year after that, in 2001, the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act is introduced in the United States. These are sanctions. Colin Powell introduced it as the Secretary of State. The Bush administration pushed it at the presidential level. In Congress, the expert on African affairs in the Congressional Black Caucus, as they saw him, Congressman Donald Payne, he pushed it with his Republican counterpart, Christopher Smith in New Jersey. So not one member of the Congressional Black Caucus voted against the sanctions, which they knew were a vindictive response to the land reclamation program. The highlight for us was a few years ago, we went to the U.S. Institute of Peace. For those of you watching who don't know what that is, It's the most dangerous, most malicious, most white supremacist think tank in this country. And it helps the State Department formulate policy. It helps the White House formulate policy. It helps the Senate Foreign Relations Committee formulate policy. And they said, we don't know how Zimbabwe is doing this, but we have to say they're winning the propaganda war. They are media and a bunch of ragtag journalists. And I'm sitting in the room while they're saying this now. And Johnny Carson, who I mentioned earlier, he's saying this. He said, but we have to admit that they're winning. And you must understand what that means. The Voice of America has a Zimbabwe station that sends out negative news about Zimbabwe 24 hours, has a Zimbabwe desk of journalists who are regime change agents that are only in this country to promote that. And so our job is to just show one of the things we learned from the overthrow of Nkrumah in 1966 is when imperialism comes after you, their job is to downplay your positive attributes. So when they said Nkrumah had a gold toilet, Nkrumah declared himself president for life, you forget that Nkrumah built a tire factory in Ghana, a manganese factory, a cocoa factory, a bicycle factory. The roads of Ghana were better than the roads of Britain. And if people built the first hydroelectrical dam on the African continent, Lumumba would have been first, but of course he was assassinated. He was already planning that with Dave Chappelle, the comedian's mother, for those of you who don't know. The United States and Britain conspired to keep Zimbabwe isolated from the Global Fund, which was supposed to be for tuberculosis and malaria and HIV/AIDS, even though they'd had the most significant HIV/AIDS turnaround in Southern Africa, where that pandemic is most crippling. And then you take that into the context of in 2010, the World Health Organization said that non-communicable diseases, heart attack, strokes, diabetes, high blood pressure, had surpassed HIV/AIDS, cholera, and malaria. And 57 million people were going to die in a 28-year period. And the fact that you would impose sanctions on an African nation who's done so much in the arena of health. Before the sanctions, they had the #1 net rollout program to combat malaria in Southern Africa. They had the #1 cholera tracking system in Southern Africa. No country in the world where agriculture is the staple of the culture, the backbone of the culture, is what's happening in Zimbabwe. It's not happening anywhere else. 68% of the farming done in Zimbabwe is done by women.
In other words, EU and US sanctions upon Zimbabwe are unreasonable, indiscriminate, disproportionate punishment of innocent civilians for political aims. This is a crime against humanity. It's no different to the carpet bombing of residents of civilians, hospitals, schools, orphanages, roads and bridges in order to destroy a country, to kill a people, or to displace them. Zimbabweans, let us unite against this crime against humanity and make this country great.